Good morning, everyone. I think we can get started. It's a couple of minutes after 9, and the program was supposed to begin at 9, so we should be on our way. First of all, welcome. My name is Adnan Hyder. I am a professor of international health here at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, also associate director for global bioethics at the Berman Institute of Bioethics. And it's my great pleasure to, first of all, welcome you and be the first one to welcome you all to both the School of Public Health as well as the Berman Institute, and particularly to this event. This is really an exciting day for many of us, and I'll spend maybe 2 minutes telling you why it's such an exciting day. First of all, let me say that on behalf of the Berman Institute of Bioethics, global bioethics has been an integral part of the development of the Institute. And since its inception, we've been discussing, talking, and contributing, and hopefully in some ways learning from the global community about the key ethics issues in international health, development, and research. And today, we have an opportunity to actually have such a wonderful event where so many colleagues from around the world are present here in person, but also I want to give out a special welcome to those of you listening to us on the internet to talk about international research ethics. And where better to start than in the continent of Africa, where many of us work, and in fact, present in the room are many, many of you from the continent. I'll identify you in a minute, but that's why I feel that this is such an important day for the Berman Institute. I also think it's really a wonderful day for the Bloomberg School of Public Health, and that's because the School of Public Health, that is large and very old and exciting and innovative, has done international work for decades. And today, it brings together the tremendous fields, not only of international health research, but also of bioethics, of public health inquiry, of clinical research, together to discuss international research ethics in the African continent. So I think it's really exciting for the school to have this and host this event. But I must admit that the most important excitement that I have is on behalf of our program, the program that we call the Johns Hopkins Fogarty Africa Bioethics Training Program. This program, very kindly supported by the Fogarty International Center of the NIH here in the US, has been running for about 15 years. And thanks to the hard work of my colleagues, Professor Nancy Kass, Joe Ali, Christina Hales, and many others, including myself, we've had a wonderful time with this program. And this program is what put together part of the agenda for today. In fact, in the room are present many of our alumni. And I would really like our Fogarty Africa Bioethics Training Program alumni to stand for just 5 seconds so that people can identify you. And join me in giving them a round of applause, please. Ladies and gentlemen, and those of you who are watching us on the internet, this represents the leadership of bioethics in Africa. These individuals are those who went out of the way. These are those individuals who decided that we want to do something innovative, that we want to do something that is responsive to the research paradigms that are changing in the continent of Africa. They took time out to learn and explore bioethics and are now contributing in their institutions, in their countries, and frankly, for many of them, on the international scene. We are just extremely proud that we are part of the story. That we are part of this description of the evolving nature of bioethics in Africa. I think it is for these reasons and for the tremendous opportunity that we have together in the room actually people from more than 20 countries. And combined with those on the internet, we have people from nearly around the world, from every continent, listening right now. So it's an opportunity not only to talk about international research ethics, but also, remember, this is in a university setting, so it's okay to disagree. It's okay to question. It's absolutely okay to challenge. And I hope that today will bring forth some bright ideas from not only the speakers, but also the audience. And I hope you will engage actively. With that introduction, it is my great pleasure to welcome our first speaker for today, who's really going to welcome you properly on behalf of the Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Mike Klag is our dean and has been a champion for international research ethics, but also a champion for making sure that different parts of Johns Hopkins University talk to each other. And this seminar actually represents that tremendous symbiotic relationship between the Bioethics Institute and the School of Public Health. Dr. Klag.
Yes, thank you, Adnan. I just wanted to stop by and welcome everyone. And everything I would say, Adnan's already said, but I want to congratulate him and Nancy for their leadership. It's 15 years. It's hard to believe. Yeah, you started when you were both in high school, I'm sure. And people from over 14 countries have been trained, 50 people, 50 trainees from Africa. And we have 40 alumni and advisees and mentors here. So it's really says great things about how important this program is in the professional lives of the trainees, that so many people are here today, have come so far. The issues of research ethics, in my previous life, I was a dean that oversaw clinical research, and part of that was human subjects protection. And that's when I first really started to interact a lot with the Berman Institute and recognized immediately the importance of research ethics as giving us a framework to make decisions about research oversight and how we conduct research. Some people see ethics, I think, research ethics, and you can disagree on it, as a luxury. You know, it's not a luxury, right? It's critically important to understanding how we do research. And the folks who are here today who have trained are really the vanguard, as you say, who are the forefront of educating the world about the importance of research ethics. So I wish I could be here with you all day today. I'm not able to, but I hope to be able to interact intermittently throughout the day. I want to especially thank the Fogarty Institute that has steadfastly supported this program from day one. And the Fogarty Institute, as you may know, is one of the institutes at NIH, and it's the smallest institute, and I say that proudly because it has a huge impact. And for them to take their resources and invest in this shows incredible vision and perspicacity. So thank you very much. So I'll stop talking and say welcome. And I, like you, sure look forward to a great conference. So,
Thank you very much, Dean Klag. And thank you for being with us for even a short time, and we hope to interact more with the leadership of the school over the day. Now it's my great pleasure to actually welcome the source of financial support for this institute, for this program. But I want to highlight something. The Fogarty International Center is not just a source of funding. The Fogarty International Center is actually a partner in this enterprise. And it is incredible. Their director, Dr. Roger Glass, who I know really wanted to be here, but there were other commitments that led him away from us, but very ably represented now by Dr. Barbara Sina, who is the acting Deputy Division Director and Program Officer of the Division of International Training and Research at Fogarty. The Fogarty is really a partner in all of these research enterprises. They provide technical expertise. They provide a lot of stakeholder engagement, support, dissemination, communication, so many different kinds of valuable support that it's been an incredible journey, and we are very pleased and proud that Barbara can share today with us. So introducing Dr. Barbara Sina.
Thank you, Adnan. It's my pleasure, and it's been a great journey to be on with all of you. I am not a bioethicist, and I've learned so much from everybody who's participated in this program. I was asked to give a brief introduction to the program. Sorry. Thank you. And to tell you why we went into this, first of all, a little bit about the Fogarty International Center. It's already been introduced what we do in general. Our mission is to build research capacity in low and middle income countries. Almost all our grants are either research or training, about 60% of them are training programs, and all of them are collaborations between US researchers and low and middle income country researchers. And although we have research programs and training programs, we recognize that there's a whole environment in which research has to take place in order to do that well. and do that to the best of everybody's ability, it requires that you have a strong and equal partnership with the ethics of the research that's taking place in the settings as well. And therefore, it was not a hard call to initiate this program in 1999. I think Jerry Kirsch, who initiated this idea when he was director of the Fogarty, walked in with this as a high item on his agenda to pull off. Anyway, some of the things we were facing in 1999, which seems like a very long time ago at this point, were at NIH, we were seeing an exponential growth in research that was taking place in low and middle income countries, and that continues to this day, if not ever more. There is a very low level of ethics review capacity in many of the countries where NIH researchers were collaborating on doing research. In fact, when I first came as a program officer, I spent a fair amount of time helping people set up IRBs in countries where they were going to do their research so they could be approved. There was, even in this country, a lack of international focus in the ethics training programs that existed here. We could find very few places that had a curriculum that included the international issues, the guidance. I mean, there was mention of it, but it was really a kind of a sideline. And then, of course, there were the enormously complex and difficult issues that erupted around trials of drugs to prevent mother-to-child transmission of HIV/AIDS. This, I think, turned the corner for many people's thinking about what was needed. There was a huge number of commentaries and lots of high-profile journals. Almost none of them were contributed by people from the countries where they're most affected by this. And again, it was also a time where the Helsinki Accord and the CIOMS regulations were being re-examined and changed, and they had large committees working on this, and again, very few representatives on those committees working on those international guidelines were from the low and middle income countries. So we had a meeting at NIH, the first Global Health Forum, or Global Ethics Forum at Bethesda in the Stonehouse, and their number one priority for recommendation for addressing the situation was training. And we had to come up with a couple of very different things than we usually do in our research training programs, but we had to really start from zero. So our initial call for programs was to develop curriculum that was both social and culturally appropriate to the places that were dealing with the international research ethics issues. And the second piece that people had to do, come in with applications to do was, of course, to do the training in that curriculum. We expected the curriculum to cover everything from, to provide deep expertise in ethics, not just a short course, not just a review of the guidelines, but to actually get to the fundamentals. So therefore, we expected the curriculum to cover both the foundational ethics theory and not just the Eastern or Western philosophical basis, but to include Asian or whatever the appropriate was, and also to span the entire range up to practical activities to apply the theoretical knowledge to the practice of research ethics in locations where there was needed. We expected that the training would result in experts who were not only able to read and contribute to the literature, but also train others to lead ethical research, review of research, and to develop their own national guidelines. These are the current programs, and they reflect a pretty common thread through the 15 years of investment. We've, I think, around 40% of the funds for the entire program have devoted to building research ethics capacity in Africa, where the lowest levels of capacity were when we started. And as you can see, many of the grants, I think they're in green, are direct grants to the institutes doing this work in the countries themselves. Overall, about 43% 3% of the 60 grants that have gone out have gone directly to overseas institutes to run these programs. This is kind of old data at this point, but we've trained over 600 trainees all over the world. Some places are more densely, but we're talking about 50 trainees perhaps in India, which is very much not enough. So I consider this sort of the thin veneer of what is needed, and as you can see in the gray areas, we're still missing very huge chunks. So we have a long way to go, even though we've done a lot at this point. And I just wanted to add this. I know this is going to be archived, so I wanted to add a set of useful resources in this field that everybody in this room has helped contribute to, of course, and others. But we did an evaluation of the program recently, and we have a set of 14 papers about the various parts of the program that you might be interested in, including 5 regional reports. We have a listserv that I send lots of information out about opportunities, and we have many other resources in different languages, et cetera, for doing this. So I hope this will be helpful to some people. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Dr. Sina. What an incredible resource the Fogarty International Center is, and I highly encourage those of you who are not familiar with the Fogarty Center to go to their website and look at the wonderful range of opportunities. They include not only grant mechanisms, but also fellowships, awards, support systems that you can link with for building careers, particularly, of course, in bioethics in Africa, but also in health research generally. And thank you for the tremendous support we've had over the years, particularly. Do convey our messages to the leadership. It's now my great pleasure to welcome my colleague, close friend, and collaborator, Professor Nancy Kass. For those of you who know her, Nancy is just not an incredible researcher, a brilliant mind, and the originator of many of different programs that are run by the Berman Institute, but fundamentally a very good human being. And that's how I think of Nancy. I think of her as fundamentally a really good human being. And that is the privilege that I've had from learning from her over the years. She remains a trusted friend and colleague, but for the purposes here, she has been instrumental in building the field of international bioethics, and particularly in moving forward thinking around frameworks and concepts of how to address ethical issues in international context. It is my great pleasure to work with her for over 15 years. Let me introduce Dr. Nancy Kass.
Thank you, Adnan. It is a pleasure to share the hosting of this symposium with you and for the ability to share running this program with you. So we are so delighted to have 100 people in the room and many, many more watching this on the web. Part of the theme of my talk is going to be that was not always true, at least in the bioethics world, in terms of interest in global issues. I feel like when I started in the field of bioethics, global issues were sort of a boutique interest, the way in certain ways genetics was, which also is something that has taken off. And what I would like to do today is trace a little bit of the history, at least from my own lens, of where we have come in terms of the kinds of questions we think about in global bioethics. Obviously, I'm going to give you a lot of generalizations, but at least it's sort of a history that made some sense to me. So here's where I'm going to be going. My thesis is that when people started to look at global bioethics, at least the early literature that I could find, there was a particular focus on the challenges posed by cross-cultural issues. If a researcher, particularly from the United States, goes to another country whose cultural norms are different, how do you do informed consent? How do you talk about research? Really important issues, issues that we might say particularly surround the ethics principle of respect. Then, as Barbara described, and I'll say a little bit more about it myself, we got into an era where ethics started to look at research design. And the question of how studies are designed became a question of ethics. In determining what was owed to particular people, a lot of things at stake there, but a piece of that is what kinds of benefits are owed to the people who are in studies. And then moving forward, and certainly animating so many of the ethics challenges we're facing today, are questions that I think are deeply entrenched with questions of justice, or maybe we might say injustice. So let me try to flesh that out a little bit. So early on, there were some really remarkable and wonderful papers looking at the question of consent. There were several papers that looked at whether, when someone went, for example, to Africa, whether the model of individual consent made sense. Not only is consent in the United States a written tradition, but it's an individual focused tradition. And the context of Africa is neither built on a written tradition nor an individual one. Folks like our wonderful colleague Godfrey Tangwa, who I'm looking for, but I can't identify the second. Godfrey, good, there you are, wrote really one of the sentinel papers that I still assign for my own course. Ruth and Carl Eiselmuden wrote a paper. Ruth Macklin was really one of the people in the bioethics world who was looking at international issues. There were lots of questions, again, about how should researchers explain research when they're going into environments where people maybe have never heard of placebos, where there was no word in a local language for research. Could husbands ethically provide consent for wives? It's not that these questions have gone away, but my sense is that these were the main focus of the bioethics issues. Again, really important questions. As we moved into the era that Barbara started to describe that led to the Fogarty program, et cetera, not only did the questions we took on become much more expansive, but the group of people looking at them sort of exploded. So without rehearsing the whole history here, I hope that this is a familiar topic to many people in the room. When the first large HIV prevention trial in the United States, ACTG 076, had a positive benefit. It was the first time anybody had ever shown that HIV can be prevented. In a study in the United States where HIV-infected women were given a very complicated regimen of AZT compared to placebo, and the chance of their babies also being infected was reduced dramatically, there became questions about what the implications of that finding were for low and middle income countries. While there was a group in Geneva comprised of both northern and southern experts who recommended that 16 trials be done, almost all of which were placebo-controlled in the developing world, there was then a backlash when the trial started, and there were accusations that giving placebos compared to, for example, a short course of AZT, for example, in Africa, was unethical because that wouldn't have happened in the United States. Raging debates happened about what is appropriate for global trials. And part of my point here is not only that the shift in our focus was so dramatic, but as I said a minute ago, people in bioethics whose careers had been eminent and important, but I would say in the United States had focused exclusively on domestic issues, took on the challenge of what was going on in the global world. Similarly, I think people in the global research world who had to, if you will, deal with ethics in a day-to-day way also became engaged in debates. There was a cross-pollinization that was really dramatic. Certainly at our school, Al Somer, our former dean, got a group of people together in a room that was even larger than this one to debate it, but it was a chance for people from international health and from bioethics to really talk with each other and to expand the way that each of us thought. Part of, again, my point here is that it really became a question of thinking about benefits. And part of the debate was how much benefit do we owe to the people in the trial today, and how much benefit do we owe to the community of people, the community that public health thinks about going forward. So as Barbara mentioned, This was an era when all of bioethics became engaged, and people started to question whether the ethics guidelines on which international research was to rely were clear enough. What was fascinating is that the Declaration of Helsinki, first written in 1964, that really had been thought of, and I think still is thought of as the primary international document, was used by both sides of that raging debate to justify their position. So there was a line in there that said essentially the best standard of care needs to be provided to everybody in a trial, and people who thought that placebos were acceptable said, we're not compromising the local standard, nobody gets anything that's worse than what they would have had, and people who thought that placebos were ethically unacceptable similarly used the same line to say, we know that the best standard now is giving people a full course of AZT. Again, part of the point here is not that everybody was getting engaged in the debate, but now ethics people were thinking about study design, and again, this tremendous question of benefit. One of the particular questions of benefit that I think is still not resolved, and I feel like I hear a lot of people discussing, not only narrowly the question about what to do about placebos when something exists in another setting and the local standard is so far not to provide anything, but in a more generalized sense. Does this principle of beneficence require that we do our best not to inflict harm, right? To the extent to which researchers can anticipate harm, I think we all agree that there is an ethical duty to not inflict harm. Or is there a much further affirmative duty to provide benefit to the people in trials? And I feel like in my travels, part of the debate is sometimes people go into research or go into a debate about research ethics with an assumption that people in studies must be made better off than they were when they started. Whereas other people say, no, 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 the duty of research ethics is to ensure that people are not made worse off, at least to the extent that we can anticipate that. It seems like that's a pretty fundamental debate to consider as we think about designing trials going forward. So this, again, was the issue that animated bioethics for years and years and years. The National Bioethics Commission in the United States did an entire long commission report on this. The Nuffield Council on Bioethics in the UK similarly did a very, very long report. Hundreds of scholars from the United States wrote about global research ethics. But as Barbara said, most of the debate was happening between people in the United States with each other, some people in Canada, some people in Europe. And while there were a few people, Edward Mbidi from Uganda, a few other people from the Global South engaged, the vast majority of the debates were happening in the wealthier countries. So again, with apologies, this is a little bit repeating part of what Barbara said, but the Fogarty International Center, I truly believe, my humble opinion, was visionary in saying, we've been supporting the capacity of researchers in the Global South, and it is now essential, if we're going to have high quality research, that we also support the ethics of global research. So in 2000, Fogarty funded 5 bioethics programs. We were thrilled to be in that group. In 2014, there are now 21 programs, and again, as Barbara mentioned, 8 of them now have PIs from low and middle income countries, including our partner, Makerere University in Uganda, with Nelson Sewankambo as the director. So let me move into what I'm going to call the third era, which is global ethics bringing considerations of justice to the fore. And I don't mean in any way to suggest that in all of those standard of care debates, justice wasn't centrally important. But I do think that there was a tremendous emphasis on benefit and what kind of benefit is owed, and people weighing where you get most benefit. Probably that was a catalyst that got us even further into thinking about questions of justice. This question about the 1090 gap is not a new one, but I think there is even more attention now that the bioethics world is paying attention to global research. Layers of the onion get peeled back, and people start to say, so what are the questions being asked? Who do they benefit? Who's funding them? What is the agenda? And that becomes a really important dialogue sort of at the macro level of what we're thinking about in the context of global ethics. Lots of questions, once people started to focus on the study design and think about what happens during the study itself, the next set of questions is, okay, when the study's over, 4 years later, 5 years later, then what happens? Not only what happens in terms of the relationship Did the researchers from the, for example, North American country go back home? But what happens to the people? What happens to the people who were in those studies? What counts as fair benefits to the people who decide to get involved in research? In certain ways, this is again blending whatever one's interpretation of beneficence is, what's owed to people, with what kind of benefit do people have to be made better off with this sense of justice. If drugs and programs seem to be effective, should they be continued? And if we have some gut level that says, well, yeah, they need to be continued, what does that actually mean? What does it mean in a practical, real-life way? They need to be continued for whom? And who has the responsibility to provide them? And it, of course, even gets more complicated if you're testing an investigational product that isn't even sort of regulatorily approved. Lots of people, including some colleagues here at Johns Hopkins, took up this question of ancillary care, which is just another twist on justice. So question one was, so what happens when the trial is over? Or do we owe particular positive, effective, seemingly effective drugs to people afterwards? But then again, when you start to focus on what's going on in the trial itself, even if you've worked out whether people get the drug or the placebo, people come in who have very little access to health care. They learn that the people running this study, who sometimes just built a brand new clinic for the study, have a lot of nurses and doctors, more than they've seen in their community for their whole lifetimes, and they want to bring in their child who has an infected foot. Or they want to bring in their colleague, their friend, who has malaria, but it's an HIV study, and trying to figure out what the duties are of researchers who are there to do a particular kind of study is obviously also a question of justice, and very easy to play out why the answers might be yes, they need to provide care, no, they can't, but we actually need practical guidance there, and it's just another way where global ethics has been investigating questions that are so much more expansive than I think where we started out 25 years ago. Lots of questions about what it means to have a fair partnership. It's certainly something we talk to our African colleagues in this program about a lot. And ultimately, is research making the world a more just place? I think we use all sorts of terms, all sorts of language for what it means, what our goals are when we do public health research in less wealthy parts of the globe. And while some people might use the language of we're improving public health, which is true, I think a lot of other people would take on the language of justice. So lots of unanswered questions here. The standard of care questions, despite the fact that people have been writing about them for 20 years, have not been resolved. Community engagement is one of the really hot and important issues in terms of whether that will make a difference in making research both more respectful and more just, and lots of questions in justice. What I thought I would close with is just giving you a little bit of detail, and part of it, I have to say, comes from, again, our having just such excitement and pride in what our colleagues have been doing for the last 15 years through this program, to just give you a sense that the slides we showed at the beginning, that this was all a North American debate, is changing. So this is a slide we put together from our program, from the 38 people who have gone through our program over the last 14 years. I know it's hard to read everything, but I'll point out to you that the column on the right displays that from our 38 alumni, there have been 210 publications. To me, this is a staggering number, and particularly because some of these people had never published an academic paper before. 64 grants have been awarded, 151 studies have been conducted, 55 there have been 55 incidents, so to speak, of people being either an IRB member or an IRB administrator or staff member. 111 courses have been taught, 310 presentations given, and 362 workshops or conferences given. Lest you think that was just 4 people being unbelievably productive, this is now one of percentages which says that 82% of our alumni have been an author on a publication, 55% on a grant, 87% of studies conducted, et cetera, et cetera. I won't rehearse everything, but the productivity and accomplishment of these people who, as Adnan said, had the initiative and vision to decide perhaps to be the first person studying bioethics in a formal way from their whole country is really remarkable, and hats off to all of you, and keep up the good work. So I guess my closing comment as we think about global ethics and the challenges, which are enormous and daunting, and so many are unresolved, is I think it does come back to the people. I just wanted to show, I think most of you know, we had a reunion of our program the last 2 days, and hot off the press, because our last set of pictures had so few people in them, here are the alumni of the Fogarty African Bioethics Training Program. So with that, will you introduce Ruth or shall I? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kass. I think the capturing these tremendous decades of work in the 3 era is incredibly powerful, and I hope that in the discussion time we get some of our colleagues in the audience to react to that, to see whether you agree with that description, and how would you describe it further? What are the critical elements in each one of those eras? As many of you know, I do a lot of work in public health, and as I travel around, people often ask me, don't you do a little bit of ethics? And I say, yes, I do. And they say, but how did you get started? And how did your School of Public Health do ethics? And I say there's a very simple answer. It's called Ruth Faden. The reason the School of Public Health does ethics, the reason that I am in ethics, the reason for many, many people around the world in ethics is Ruth Faden. And it is my honor and great pleasure to obviously introduce Professor Ruth Faden, the Executive Director of the Berman Institute. She now holds the Andrea Dracopoulos Directorship Chair at the Berman Institute of Bioethics. Dr. Faden has been a long-time professor at the School of Public Health, started work in bioethics, got many of us engaged, but not only engaged, truly excited about bioethics. So that while you see a few colleagues who might be at the Berman Institute, there are many other colleagues in public health who may not call themselves part of the bioethics community, but think in ways that are influenced by Professor Ruth Faden. So what a pleasure to introduce you today, Dr. Faden, to talk to us about issues of justice. Dr. Ruth Faden.
All right. So now I'm going to completely disappoint you after that introduction. I have to step back, and you may be tired of being welcomed, but I just have to add my formal welcome as well as sort of representing all of the Berman Institute to those of Dean Klag's and Dr. Sina's and Dr. Kass's and Dr. Hyder's. As you've already heard, this symposium really does mark an amazing milestone. It's the beginning of the 15th year of this extraordinary program, which is truly, and I believe this, one of the jewels in the crown of the Berman Institute and the School of Public Health, the Bloomberg School as well. We are all so proud, really so incredibly proud of this program, of the amazing trainees and what they're accomplishing. And Nancy just showed you in that one slide of a sort of empirical indicator, set of empirical indicators of the accomplishments, but it's also the human beings themselves. You'll get some more additional sense of the amazingness of some members of this group as the day progresses, but it truly is just a source of tremendous, tremendous pride. Speaking provincially from the standpoint of the Institute for a moment, these nearly 40 trainees have enriched the life of all of us at the Institute in so many ways. We've been so inspired by your aspirations and now by your achievements. And also, we have been so inspired by what Nancy Kass and Adnan Hyder and Joe Ali, who's taking photographs carefully, and Christina Halez, wherever she is, has done to make the training experience really worthy of these extraordinarily talented people. So I want to take this opportunity to, in front of this wonderful crowd and everybody else watching, to thank them, and also to thank the Fogarty International Center for the support that has allowed our African training program to exist and hopefully to continue. So thank you to all of you for making this possible. Now, in addition to my welcome, I have been asked to make a few remarks about justice and health research, which is kind of easy for me because that's what I do, right, is justice theory. And I will, in some respects, be supporting and reinforcing what Nancy said in her remarks. And so I'm going to backtrack a little bit and, of course, acknowledge that traditionally in research ethics, justice was enshrined in the Belmont Report in a very particular way. Justice was understood. These are not my slides. I don't care what that, did I hit something? All right. I don't care that they're up there, but I didn't want you to be worried and anxious that you can't read them. I have no slides, right? So let's be clear, they're not my slides because I have no slides, right? I have an aversion to slides that are primarily text, and my talk is pretty much all text. So if we step way, way back to the Belmont Report, which is the way in which justice is introduced to many people when they first think about research ethics through that report, there's a particular take on justice and the role that it plays in research in that document, which has had such a profound effect on research around the world. And that is that we should think about justice as the distribution of, in terms of the distribution of the benefits and burdens of conducting research, and especially about the burdens. So justice in the Belmont Report is highlighted as about not unduly burdening, not particularly burdening the poor and the powerless. That's really the force of how we think about justice from the standpoint of the Belmont Report. Particularly when those burdens fall on people who do not benefit directly from the participation in research, or where the communities from which they come do not benefit from the findings of that research. So that's been the sort of historically deeply rooted understanding of justice, and it remains incredibly important. We should never lose sight of the fact that protecting the poor and the powerless continues to be one of the most important functions of research ethics. We should never step back from that. And one of the most important functions of the ethics committees that are charged with overseeing research. Right? That is sort of a key core consideration. Incredibly important mission. But for a long time, however, and as Nancy has noted, even in global health research, especially in global health research, it's been recognized that justice considerations in health research do go far beyond that very important responsibility. So I can't overstate the importance of that first responsibility. We are obligated in research ethics always to protect the powerless and the poor. But at the same time, we have to remember that advancing the interests of the powerless and the poor requires that we take a wider look at questions of justice and research that go beyond examining the particulars of a particular protocol. And that's what I want to talk to you about. So when I look at your program, I see broader questions of justice throughout your program for today. And that's not surprising to me. Questions of justice and research really cannot be abstracted from questions of justice in the basic social institutions and structures of society, both nationally and globally, in which research takes place. So you can't think about the justice of health research in abstraction from considerations of justice in the wider society, both nationally and globally. Now, our focal interest today is Africa, where there are such incredibly profound inequalities in wealth and power within the countries in which research is being conducted, as well as transnationally or globally between funders and host countries. And so in this context, of course, wider considerations of justice are inevitably engaged. But let me be clear here. I would submit that anywhere where social institutions and structures are characterized by significant inequalities in social status and income, which, by the way, is most of the world, okay, broader questions of justice often overshadow more particular protocol-specific questions about the research itself. In the United States, for example, one need only think about HeLa cells and the experience of Henrietta Lacks and the Lacks family with big science to see how critically important, okay, wider considerations of justice are to the ethics of research. Their story, and indeed much of research, when we think about the ethics of science, is, of course, characterized by questions of justice that may be particular to a protocol or a research design, but they're also, more foundationally, about background conditions of justice and how the least of us live. I don't think you can look at that story, and I hope many of you are familiar with it, without appreciating that so much of what troubles us morally has to do with the background injustice of the situation in which the Lax family found itself. And similarly, when we look at questions in terms of health research in Africa or anywhere in the world characterized by injustice more broadly, what we find troubling often has less to do with the specifics of a particular protocol and more to do with the context in which the protocol is going to be implemented. Now, my own work is in justice theory, and I can never talk about it without, of course, acknowledging my wonderful colleague and co-author and dear friend, Madison Powers. In 2006, Madison and I put out our first book on justice and health, and the theory we put out there has now come to be called the twin aim theory in a lot of shorthand. What we're doing now is exploring and building and developing that twin aim theory from a global perspective. So the second book, which will eventually get done, hopefully sooner than later, is looking at global justice and also about the relationship between justice theory and human rights theory and practice. And I know I'm looking at my dear colleague a couple rows up. You'll be hearing more about human rights in the next session. Now, I thought about talking about the theory, but it occurred to me that maybe talking about justice theory is not the best way to start a symposium. This symposium or any symposium, except if you're sort of a justice theory nerd, so I'm going to not do that. I saw some anxious faces for a moment. She's going to segue into an account of justice theory, which I'm not going to do. What I'm instead going to do is something that I find myself doing in more and more occasions, which is trying to distill some of the implications of thinking about justice theory into some very specific questions or sets of questions. So I'm going to leave you with 4 sets of questions that I would like you to be thinking about as the day proceeds. And these are questions about justice that indeed go beyond important issues of the fair distribution of the research burdens and benefits in a specific protocol. And I do want to just say one more time, there is no more important obligation, especially from the standpoint of ethics committees and research ethics frontline professionals, than ensuring, that participants in a particular study are treated in a way that can be defined as and defended as just. But I also want to submit that we have a huge responsibility to think more broadly. And I think this applies to all of us who are engaged in research and all of us who are engaged in research ethics. So here are the four questions, and they're directed really at training a justice lens at the totality of the research portfolio. And you may think of the research portfolio institutionally, or you may think of the research portfolio in terms of a particular district or province. You may think about it nationally, or you may think about it globally. Now, these questions are rooted in our twin aim theory of justice, but they can find support in many, many other approaches to justice as well. So here's the first question. In the design of the health research that composes the portfolio, is the focus exclusively on health outcomes? Or does the portfolio also include outcomes that relate to other dimensions of well-being that are terribly important to justice and to the extent to which people can live a decent life? These are dimensions like personal security, human bonds and attachments, cognition, respect, social standing, self-determination. Does the portfolio of health research look also at the impact of health interventions and health policies on these other dimensions of well-being? Or does it only look exclusively on health outcomes? And I would submit from a justice standpoint, there's something problematic if we are only concerned about whether what we do in health research affects only health. Here's the second question. Is there a regular effort to systematically investigate the impact of what is being studied, the range of what is being studied, on specifically, particularly disadvantaged groups that are included in the community to whom the portfolio is directed. So wherever research is being conducted, whatever your focus, there are always groups that are particularly disadvantaged. And the challenge here is whether we are systematically collecting data on the impact of what is being studied on those who are particularly disadvantaged. Are these data being regularly collected in ways that allow investigators, and importantly, those responsible for the well-being of the population, to make assessments, okay, of what is happening as a consequence of the health research being conducted on those who are particularly disadvantaged? So that's the second question. And you'll see these questions are, of course, all related. Here's the third set of questions. Is anyone positioned? Does anyone regularly ask? Who is most likely to benefit from the evidence that is being generated by the portfolio of health research? Who will be the losers and who will be the winners? Because there are always winners and losers. Put another way, is there a systematic effort to assess whether the research portfolio has the potential to widen or narrow existing unjust inequalities in health or well-being? To the extent that the research portfolio has the potential to widen existing unjust inequalities, we have a particularly pernicious concern from the standpoint of justice. Hopefully, the health research portfolio is providing evidence that will help narrow unjust inequalities in health. But that is not always the case, nor can it always be assumed is a given. Who, if anyone, has responsibility for anticipating the justice issues that might result as a consequence of who benefits and who loses? And how ought people to be thinking about the design and analysis of future research? Is there a particular obligation to design research, particularly in settings in which there is tremendous inequality in health and well-being, such that one goal of the research is indeed to chip away, to even a little bit narrow those inequalities? And finally, here's the fourth set of questions. Are there groups whose health needs and interests are not being adequately, fairly represented in research on a particular public health priority, say like Ebola or HIV/AIDS, or across the health research portfolio more broadly? Consider, for example, say burial workers in Ebola research, or pregnant women in HIV/AIDS research. If the needs and interests, the health needs and broader interests of these groups, or similarly situated groups, are not being fairly represented in health research, and this is not merely are they included in the study, it's rather what are their particular health needs and interests? What are their particular health and more broader well-being interests, right? And are those particular ones the subject of research inquiry? It's not sufficient from a standpoint of justice to say, well, let's make sure we have a couple of X people, right, in our studies. We have to make sure that the research questions that we are asking and attempting to answer also address the health needs and other needs and interests of people who are, for whatever reason, right, pushed off to the side, not your primary target. Who's responsible for assuring, for looking at, for questioning, right, whether in fact the health interests of everyone are fairly or equally included in the portfolio of research? Who's responsible, and this is the most important thing, for rectifying, right, for addressing, for modifying, for changing when we discover, as we almost inevitably always do, that there are people whose health interests are not adequately being represented in the research questions that are being asked? Now, these four sets of questions are not easy ones to answer, in part because they are often homeless in our structure for oversight and examination of the ethics of research. That is to say, they have no obvious institutional home in the systems that we have established for the oversight of the ethics of health research. It doesn't fall to anybody, right, to take this big picture look. But that just means that there are systems that need to change if we are to do our jobs properly. Systems need to change if we are to ensure that health research in Africa and everywhere is truly just and truly helping us move to a more just world. So I leave it to you to solve that problem. Right. Thank you so much.
I think I don't need to demonstrate why Professor Ruth Faden drives bioethics, as she has demonstrated and now challenged us to think about these 4 critical issues in the framework of justice, and think about international research ethics, in this case particularly in Africa. What I'd like to do now is to really open up the dialogue and see if people in the audience have comments. I'd like to request Barbara, Nancy. I'm not sure how long Dr. Faden can stay with us, if possible, to come up here, and then we can entertain some questions from the audience. I want to highlight that we have 2 speakers, one on the left, one on the right side. So please, if you have a question, line up. Try and grab a spot right next to the microphones, and we can start a dialogue. I think what you've heard this morning is really an introduction to the remarkable changes in the landscape of research ethics in Africa. We've heard from Barbara Sina about the support and the changes across many, many programs, of which only one is represented here at Johns Hopkins, but so many other colleagues have been thinking and working in this field. We have heard from Nancy Kass about the 3 eras of bioethics and what those eras represent, and the interesting development and how one led to another. And then from Dr. Faden about concerns of justice and the 4 questions that she's challenged us with. So I'd certainly like to welcome any comments or reflections from the audience. Please feel free. This is an opportunity to talk and reflect, give your opinions, walk up please, make sure you can take a position next to the mic, and we can start the discussion rolling. Yes, sir. Please, and do introduce yourself briefly before your question.
Good morning. My name is Ed Bartlett. Good to see all of you. And I'd like to address my question to Ruth Faden. So yes, the recognition of broader justice issues are important. Yet I think we're all aware of cases where research has become politicized, where it's become subordinated to a broader, whatever agenda is out there, political, ideological, or whatever. I think we all know of those cases where it's happened. So do you see a possibility if we place too much attention on these broader justice issues, do you see a possible undermining of key research design principles and therefore undermining the validity and the accuracy of the research results?
Thank you, Ed. My answer is no, I don't. I thought you were going to go in a different direction. I do see a risk that a focus on wider considerations of justice in examining a research portfolio from the standpoint of any level, the risk that way of setting up a responsibility is open to political manipulation. So that's where I thought you were going. By that I mean I can see that in the language of seeking justice or a more just set of criteria for assessing a research portfolio or a set of research projects or programs, that there could be an opening for the questions to become politicized, just as questions of justice themselves more broadly are often politicized. And that's something that has to be guarded against and is really a significant challenge. What I don't see as a risk is that by looking at justice as a primary consideration from a more abstract level, that you necessarily have to sacrifice anything having to do with the quality, the rigor, or the scientific validity of the work that's done. The work always has to be first rate from the standpoint of any kind of consideration about justice. You serve no one's interests if the work that is done is substandard, or the quality of the data that are result as a consequence provides you with information that turns out to be not the appropriate kind of information based on which clinical practice or public health policy should rest. So I don't think a conflict lies there.
Thank you.
Hope I don't break this. Good morning. My name is Robert Sekubugu. My question goes to Ruth. I don't know what you think about justice issues in the context of injustices. A lot of times we expect that researchers or research programs should be just and exercise justice, but they're working in this environment that is full of injustice. In countries like this one, issues of justice are discussed fairly well, somehow in a superstructure manner. But in many countries in Africa, you see a big distance between the leadership, the resource allocation, and the researcher. And if we take the notion that we should be just in the environment that is so full of injustice, what advice would you give?
Yeah. So, Robert, I would say not only is that the most difficult set of, the most difficult part of what I'm calling for, right, is recognizing the limited control that each of us as individuals have, right, over the horrible circumstances in which many of us conduct our work. And I mean truly horrible, and I want to underscore what I said before, although these profound inequalities are so incredibly evident and so incredibly extreme in some parts of the world, they are present almost everywhere, right, including in the United States. Not at the level or the intensity with which you experience them, but it is not uncommon, for example, for us to hear as people who teach ethics in a school of public health or with nursing students or medical students, and they will say to us, but I can't do anything about how awful the circumstances are in which the research is going to be done, or I have to make these terrible choices when I know that someone else above me has the power to make things better, and they won't do it, right? So how can I act justly in a circumstance in which what I know is wrong, is unjust, is going to be perpetuated by people over which, or regimes, or administrations, or we fill in the blank, over which I have no control? And so my response to that is first, you have to recognize that as an individual, right, you can only exercise and only have moral responsibility for what it is that you can control. And you sometimes have to make the least unjust decision. You have to take the least unjust decision because you realize that every choice you have is in some respect unsatisfactory, right? And then also there's a separate set of questions about whether you have or to what extent you have unique or special responsibilities because you're a health professional or a health researcher or a bioethicist to advocate or otherwise work for changing the wider social situations in which you are forced to make these very difficult and awful decisions sometimes. But what I was calling for in my talk was a more systems level. It's a challenge at the systems level. It's not a challenge that any one of you as individuals can assume and take on as your personal challenge. It's a systems challenge, and it requires systems change. And of course, systems changes are more difficult in conditions, in background conditions of corruption and background conditions of absence of rule of law and in background conditions in which there is not a democratic or political legitimacy. So I don't mean to suggest these are easy things to do, but I suggest that they are responsibilities that we all share, but that must be developed at the systems level.
And I think this exchange is really important. Sorry, Nancy, you
Well,
wanted to
I
add?
just wanted to build on what Ruth said. Robert, it's such a great question. And tie it to something else you said, Ruth, about the really challenging question of the who, right? I mean, I think it's, that is the hard question. There are a lot of players, particularly in the international collaborative research space. And some of them are people like you, and some of them are the people who run big projects in your country and externally, and some are the funders. And again, I say this gingerly because we all sort of get very anxious about additional requirements put on us by funders, but some of those requirements have actually led to really profound change. It was, because of funders that ethics review actually happened in so many countries where it hadn't before. And there can be very small changes that happen from particular either incentives, so to speak, from funders or requirements. And I don't mean to suggest that this is the solution to all these by any means, but I just wanted to put into the conversation that there are a lot of stakeholders, and sometimes there's a particular voice when you look at the 8 voices involved that can make a difference who we weren't necessarily thinking about.
I think this is, reminds me of a question I used to be asked very often, particularly in the developing world, that our engineers are corrupt, our lawyers are corrupt, our police officers are corrupt. Why do you expect our researchers to be morally and ethically upright? What is the fundamental difference between our researchers? And I think it's a really difficult, but as you say, a really important question to be framed at the systems level. Could we have our next question, please? Do let us know. Robert Sesugubu Froz from Uganda. So do introduce yourselves, your institution, and your country, please.
Hello, I'm Leanne Miller. I work at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the Science Office for the Global HIV Program. So I review the research that comes through and is sponsored by CDC from an ethics and a technical perspective. So the question that I have, I think kind of unpacks on several levels, but it's around the people that are involved and who conduct the research in countries throughout the world. So in many instances, they are people who we look for, who have similar characteristics to the people we might be researching. And they ask sensitive questions, and they might find out things related to corruption. They might find out things related to violence. They might find out things that are, related to wrongdoing, and they're also, in some ways, a member of this population. So my question is if we can kind of unpack this, what do we do to protect the people who we're involving in our research and we want to be our partners, and then also in some way we're putting them in a position where they're either finding out something that really is uncomfortable, that might be about their peer, that might be about their peer group, there might be about their community.
Right.
And in some ways it can put them at risk, is my feeling. And what do we do to sort of protect them as well as the people who participate in the research?
Thank you. Who would like to start? Nancy?
It's such a great question, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of these same issues came up both in the human rights panel, and Robert, who just spoke, is giving a presentation later on the data collection he's done with people he calls the implementers. And I think maybe what you're referring to are the people who have this middle level role in a research study, the ones who really have the human contact with the participants. So I hope we'll hear even more insight on that. I'm going to say something which is probably silly because it's so obvious, but I do think that different research teams end up setting really different tones among the people who work for the research team. And I think it's something that one doesn't necessarily think of up front, because we all would like to think that we are kind and respectful with our own staff. And let's assume we are. It's a whole different level from from inviting questions and having regular meetings. And there's, I guess my own immediate sense is that there's a lot that will happen just from being able to talk. Now, there may be other kinds of concerns that emerge if truly someone is put at risk by virtue of knowing information. And that is absolutely a different kind of protection. Our colleague Chris Byrer, who couldn't be here today because he's in Geneva, has written about the responsibilities of PIs to think in advance about stopping rules, not because of traditional DSMB criteria, but because of the safety of your own staff. And it's important to brainstorm in advance what kinds of how you're going to try to protect people, but what's the line that obviously cannot ever be crossed. It's not the role of an IRB in a narrow sense to think of the safety of the staff, but I think increasingly IRBs are looking at that in certain kinds of environments.
I think it's a really important question, by the way, that you've raised, and it's not just the acquisition of that knowledge, but very importantly, not just from the perspective of an agency like CDC, but also from the individual researcher's perspective. Now that they are aware, what should they do with that knowledge, particularly if it has potential legal implications as well. And that's really onerous in many, many instances. Our next question, please.
Good morning. I'm Joseph Gaye from Botswana. My question to Prof. Ruth Faden. With regards to the 4 questions that you have raised, well, of course, I understand that you said you are leaving the solutions to people to reflect on, but I'm just wondering whether you have, in theory, some kind of systematic way of addressing them. Do you have a theory of how they could be addressed?
So I don't know if anyone has yet seen the movie The Theory of Everything. It's the Stephen Hawking story. I think you were asking for a theory of everything, and I don't have a theory of everything. We have an account or a theory of justice with which we're working that we hope will provide some guidance in helping to think about how to answer or how to establish what the right answers are to the questions I've posed. But the theory I know already helps because it helps me figure out what questions to ask. And I think that's at least a good part of the battle towards moving things forward from the standpoint of justice. On the first question, I'll give you one quick example. So it's a challenge to say to health research, which has a particular remit within whatever funding structure you're looking at, a foundation, a national agenda. Health research has its place, other people do, other institutions and funders and entities and investigators and staff research other areas. So it's a real challenge to say that health research should be looking at outcomes other than health outcomes. But it's a recognition, and we know this from many areas of inquiry, social science and biological science, that health affects many other aspects of life, and that many other aspects of life affect health. And that if we fail, right, to take a more integrated approach, at least at some points in the course of the development of a research program for something like HIV/AIDS or Ebola, if we fail to look at the broader impact of our interventions as we research those interventions on other aspects of life, we may end up either supporting interventions that on balance, in fact, lead to greater injustice or reduce well-being, and we may overlook interventions that may not do as much for health but do wonderful things for other aspects of life, and because we are only looking at their health impact, fail to appreciate how much well-being could be achieved perhaps quite efficiently if we were to continue with those interventions. So that's not a theoretical answer. It's more, again, another theoretical challenge grounded in a lot of empirical research. The hard part is putting that all together, right? And I think that's where you're asking for guidance. How exactly, with limited resources and very clear political constraints, are we supposed to take this broader look, right? And that's what that's where I think most of the hard work is yet to be done.
I think this is a great conversation, and maybe at some other points we can have more interaction on this. Thank you, Joseph. Please.
Good morning. I'm Alan Regenberg, Director of Outreach with the Berman Institute. As a quick aside, I'm live tweeting today, so if anybody wants to join in, we're at #BioethicsAfrica, one word. And I have a question via Twitter from our former colleague Dan O'Connor, who's now head of humanities and social science with the Wellcome Trust. And he asks, what single action from funding bodies would most strengthen bioethics capacity building in Africa?
Wow, that's a
Thank
tough
you,
one.
Dan.
Thanks, Dan, for that question. I hope you can hear us. And yeah, Barbara, why don't you start?
So as one funding body to another funding body, I guess. I know Dan. I think one of the steps we would like to get to, and we've identified this in our future next 10-year kind of plan, is we have yet as funders we have not unleashed the creativity of thinking, of experimentation in this realm, okay? We don't have enough people who are doing research in the ethical questions, and I think we need to encourage it greatly and give them huge credit and involvement with the rest of the research world, and instead of keeping it as a very separate entity. So I see what happens here at the School of Public Health, where it's very integrated to be, just fantastic as a way of the research speaking to the ethics, speaking to the research back and forth. Integration it's a total human endeavor that requires unleashing all the creativity we put into the research world as well.
Dan, it probably goes without saying that several of us would love to have a longer conversation with you about this. I'm going to alter the question and give you two answers. And we also appreciate the thoughtfulness behind the question. I think one huge thing is investing in PhD education. I think that there is tremendous value in having some background in bioethics, and at least judging from my own experience, I feel like it took me years and years and years to start to feel some comfort in taking on some hard questions. And so I think investing in PhD education is tremendous. I am proud that some of our alumni have now gone to other places that are less expensive than Johns Hopkins to get PhDs, but that's one huge thing. I also think that there is, the NIH has done some of this, I think there are ways to mentor people into the development of their own research projects. Writing a really high quality research grant application is really hard. And again, I feel like in my life, I benefited from working with a lot of other colleagues who were doing it. I was brought up in a culture where that happened. If you're not brought up in a culture where everybody around you is writing it, it's really hard to write a competitive grant application. But there are so many ideas emerging from our colleagues, and I think that there are ways to get money for an idea, and to get money to travel to work with someone else who will help mentor you, and to write a first draft and get money for writing a first draft, and get critique on that from a team of smart people. And then it's sort of a evolutionary plan to work after 1 or 2 years to submitting a full grant, and I think that would be a tremendous contribution too.
But I think I hope, Dan, you're listening, because fundamentally what we are saying is there may not be a single magic bullet to solve this problem. And the answer that one gives today will change over 10 years. And that's what we saw so investment patterns also need to be responsive to a systems approach as well as to the different needs of the community. Let me invite the last question of the day, please.
So, my name is Rosemary Morgan. I'm a research fellow here at Johns Hopkins with the Research in Gender and Ethics Building Stronger Health Systems group. And my question is for Dr. Ruth Faden, but I'd welcome responses from any of the panel. I was really interested in your idea of justice as a critical ethics issue and making sure we target vulnerable, disadvantaged groups and address their important health needs. I was just wondering where you see gender fitting into this, and how can we make sure gender kind of has a significant place at the table.
Thank you.
It's been something I've been working on for 25 years. Yes, to me it's central. It's only one of many critical ways in which we need to think about justice and in health research, but gender is key. And one of my battles, and you may have heard me, one of my hobby horses, I should say, one of my battles is a little overstating it. One of my hobby horses for the longest time has been to broaden the notion of what justice and health research means for women and for gender issues more broadly as for other groups. It has been for a long time a matter of counting, like how many women are enrolled in trials or how many children or how much money is being spent. But let's just stay with women for a moment. How many women are enrolled in our studies? You see now we have more women than men, or we have enough women, or whatever. And that's really not the point, right? It's a consideration, and it may be an important consideration from the standpoint of the interest of a particular woman who might benefit, depending on the nature of the research herself, from participating in it. But the real concern and the real focus, and we'll stay with gender, but you could put in whatever group is of concern to you from a matter of, from the standpoint of justice, is that we understand what their needs and interests are, and that we have a balanced research portfolio that ensures that their health research and interests and needs are adequately included, fairly included, that they get the same attention as those of other people whose health interests and needs may be different. My current focus right now is on pregnant women, so to put in a plug, if there's a group of people in the world whose health interests are not adequately represented in the research portfolios of just about any health area of research, it's pregnant women, and there's a lot, there are very many complicated ethical and legal issues behind why pregnant women are not, their health interests are not adequately represented. But we have to be thinking really creatively, both in terms of what we mean by what justice requires, and also how we might try to solve whatever the barriers are towards achieving a more just research portfolio.
Thank you. Any other response to that? Great. Thank you very much for your question. I want to first ask if there's any other quick reflection from any of the panelists before we bring the session to a close. Well, what a wonderful session it's been. I'm not even going to try and attempt to summarize what we've heard, but simply to say that what we've done here today is to kickstart a day of reflection about international research ethics in Africa, and we wanted to do that with the strong support of our community. And a very important part of that community that supports a lot of research was, of course, the NIH. So having Dr. Barbara Sina here was extremely important, again, as a partner in this enterprise. And as you've heard, a tremendous amount of work has been done over the past decade in research ethics, and we hope increasingly FOGD will remain a critical partner in this enterprise. We also heard a little bit about the changing nature of research ethics, the three eras defined by Professor Nancy Kass, and very importantly, an introduction to, for some of you, I hope, to the wealth of resource that we have in the FOGD Africa Bioethics Training Program alumni, who represent over 15, 17 countries in Africa and are spread out throughout that continent. These individuals are working in critical areas, both in terms of location, but also in terms of content. And I hope that many of you will use the opportunity to get to know them, to engage with them, and develop collaborative relationships. And then critically for us, we've been challenged to think for the rest of not only today, but also leading on from today, about justice issues in international research ethics, things that many of us might have been doing, but maybe we didn't have the right language, maybe we didn't have the right framework. And now we are being challenged to talk about indicators and systematic methods and concrete ways in which systems can be changed. That's a very tall order, but it's also a very important issue. And I hope that with these important areas of deliberation, they will affect our not only formal sessions till the rest of today, but also our coffee, tea, and lunch break interactions as well. I was amiss in not informing you of the most important fact, that if you exit through those two doors on the left and the right, you will find restrooms. And those might be needed. We will also have coffee and tea served in the adjoining room. It's been a great pleasure to moderate this session. Please join me in one last round of applause for our panelists, and thank you very much for being here.